Welcome back to Balmer's Workshop. It is always a pleasure to have you here. A huge thank you to my recent subscribers. There's been a bunch of you, and it's folks like you and the people who are putting in the positive comments and providing the questions who are really making this all worthwhile. I come in on my weekends to edit all this material, and of course I take a lot of extra time during my work week as well to create the footage in the first place. So again, when people are subscribing and commenting and liking the videos, it's really a nice payback for me. So if you haven't subscribed already and you find yourself coming back and rewatching stuff, please do subscribe. It's a big support and I appreciate it very much. Go back and watch part 1 of this series if you haven't seen it already. We'll talk about in it we talked about the design work that goes into this bumper. We did some coroplast work. We actually started the steel build as well, beginning with the winch tray and working outwards from there. We did a little bit of freehand plasma cutting and also some forming. Alrighty, so we got the driver's side panel tacked in place. Nice clean fit up again. And you can see that it fits up nicely with the plastic. So it gives me some confidence that I can move on to the next step and that my 137-degree bend will be exactly what I'm looking for. So everything should be good so long as I stick to the plan. Okay, so I've set the camera way back there so that you can hopefully get a good idea of what this angle looks like. I had this marked as a 137-degree bend. In fact, I wound up going to 134, so a little bit tighter than I had listed on the template. But if you look, it matches up very, very nicely. So I'm going to now cut this plastic template out. I'll leave this portion and I'll insert my steel piece, tack it in place if it looks good, make tiny adjustments if it doesn't, and we'll move on from there. But that's pretty good progress in my opinion. I'll leave you there while I cut this tape away, or pull the tape off rather, and you can have a look at least how it fits on the first try. So let's try putting this piece in and seeing how it fits. Hopefully my hands aren't blocking the picture for you there. That's pretty darn clean. Almost a perfect angle. I'll bring you around the front here so you can see I do have a little bit of grinding to do. Very little bit. So if you look at where it meets up, let me just get this nicely placed. Everything fits really well. Well, you know what? I have a tiny gap at the top there, but really that's virtually just weld prep. So no, I'm pretty much good to go on this one. I can just put some magnets. I'll put a magnet on this face and a magnet on this face so that I know everything lines up really well, and then I'll tack away. Welding magnets are great for securing panels in position for welding using the angles that are built into the magnets themselves, but they're also good just for keeping surfaces flush, as you see me doing here, making sure that the faces of the existing panel and the panel that I'm just adding remain exactly flush through the tack-up process. And speaking of these panels, in part 1 I did all of the forming that needed to be done, meaning I put all of the bends into the panels where applicable, using a press brake that I made here in the shop. It's very basic, but it does a decent job. Again, have a look at part 1 if you haven't seen that already. Now you can take a cut and weld approach to all of your bends, meaning rather than forming them or bending them in a press, you can simply take 2 panels and weld them together at the angle that you want to create. And you can do that for your entire bumper if you want. I recommend against it just because the more long welds you do, the more opportunity there is for heat warpage and heat shrink and also contamination. Plenty of freehand plasma cutting in this particular job, and here is some more of it. This is the fair lead plate. I have yet to drill out the holes that are marked there for the fair lead to bolt to, but obviously the hole is cut for the winch cable to go through, and our angles are cut on the sides. This is 1/4" mild steel. My plasma cutter cuts nice and clean up to 3/16. Anything above that, it starts getting pretty rough, and as you can see here, even though I made my pass at pretty well the best speed I could for the plasma cutter, there's a lot of slag or dross, if you want to call it that, to be chipped away, and then I'm going to have to sand these edges down nice and smooth after that. But it's still not a terrible job, and it will turn out beautiful in the end. I am confident of that. But that's what we built from that template there, which goes in front of the winch right there. So now I will go ahead and blend all that down, sand all that down, and drill those holes, and we'll get it tacked in place. And the fair lead plate is all cut out and ready to go. I have also added a receiver underneath. This is absolutely not permanent, although some people would like to have a receiver under there to be handy for lots of different things. This customer is an avid off-roader, and all that's going to do for him is lose him 2.5 inches of approach angle, so we definitely don't want that. But I have added it because it's going to allow me to use one of my handy-dandy little bumper trolleys, like this guy right here, to take the bumper off and put it back on again. The bumper trolley is adjustable in elevation and pitch, so it's very handy. And of course then I've got the bumper on a nice rolling chassis, which is easy to manipulate around the shop, so that's what I like to use. I do have a fair lead attachment for this as well, but it's just a little bit more of a pain to use, and since all of my tack welds for this are completely hidden and will be easily buffed out afterwards anyway, I'm just going to go for the easy approach and tack my receiver to the bottom, and away we go. Also, it allowed me to place a piece of 1/4-inch flat bar on top, which I then sat my fair lead plate on, which gives me an almost perfectly centered weld all the way across, and all I have to do is hold it on there with some 90-degree outside corner magnets, as I have done, and it's ready for tacking up. So I'm going to put a couple of tacks on the bottom side of that as it is, and move on to the next part. After this, we're going to run some 1 1/4 tube, 1 1/4-inch diameter, I should say, tube across the top of this all the way along, angle it up and weld it into the corners right in here, so it'll look really, really clean, I hope. But before I go ahead and do my tube, which will run over top of the fair lead plate and connect into the vertical supports here, and before I do my rear tube, which will act also as a support, what I'm going to do is add a bull bar in there. The bull bar may not stay permanently. I'll probably just put it in place and tack it. It'll act as a really good support brace for when we weld this thing up. And when I do the rest of the tack weld, so it'll keep everything in position really nicely for me by adding a structural support where there is little right now. Anyway, I've already bent it up, so I'll show you that now. If you'd like to see tube bending in much greater detail, then please check out my video series entitled How to Build Rock Sliders, a full DIY tutorial. I'll put a link at the end of the video to that. There's a ton of great information for you in there, so please do check it out. And also my Suzuki Sidekick front bumper build has some tube bending in there. I believe this clip is actually from that video. Here it is on the bench. A couple of 70-degree bends. The flat portion here is going to wind up having high lift mounts added to it, and then of course a high lift will be added on top of that, a high lift jack, or some people call them a jack all or a farm jack. Anyway, that style of jack will be added on top, so the large flat portion is beneficial, and these 70-degree angles match the 70-degree angles, or the inverse angles I should say, of these. So these are 70 degrees, and then we have the inverse of a 70-degree angle going the other way for the bull bar, and I think it'll create a really nice look. I'll put the camera in a tripod now, and I'll set the bull bar in place and center it, and we'll have a look at how it looks. So I'll just pop it in place here against my magnets that I preset, and I'm looking for about a 1/2-inch gap on each side here. Sorry, I'm probably talking too quietly. Anyway, using my magnets that I preset, put my bull bar in place, and then I set my edges of my tubes about a 1/2 inch out from these corners, so it's nice and equal. Just basically, I'm going to stand back and by eye check all of my dimensions, make sure everything looks good, and I'll take you off the tripod so you can join me for that. So what I look for is just to make sure that the bull bar looks absolutely flat with the vehicle, that it looks centered, judging by if you can look at the corners of the lights that just protrude past the bull bar there. They are very, very even, and if we move up slightly until the corners of the grill touch the corners of the bull bar, they are also very, very even. Looks really clean to me. I know that it's equidistant from the grill to the bull bar. Both sides are exactly the same. I've pre-measured that and marked it, as you can see. So I'm pretty happy with that. It looks nice and flat. It looks, the angles to me look very good, and I think that's ready to go. So I'm going to tack it in place, and then we'll see if the customer likes it or not. But even if not, at least it's a nice rigid construction after that, which I can then start tacking other tubes and stuff into and know that my dimensions are all correct. So basically what I mean is, now that I've got something spanning this, it makes the whole thing much more rigid. So I'm very confident that my dimensions will remain correct, and I can go ahead and do more work on it. But there's another step done. Now that I've got the bull bar tacked in place, I am going to go ahead and do the tube that's going to go across the top of the fair lead plate and up to the corners of the vertical supports. So figuring out my length for that, I just measured the flat portion, the top of the fair lead plate, 11 inches, and then I've got about 10 inches from the corner to the corner. So obviously that is 31 inches, and then I just added a few inches on top of that. Which brought me to 36 inches, and that's the length of tube I cut. 36-inch piece. Here it is over here, and the way I'm figuring out my bends is I found center on that piece. Here's my center, measured 5.5 inches out on each side. There's my 11 inches for that flat spot on the fair lead plate. I've drawn arrows for the directions of my bend, so these will be starts of the bend. So a lot of the time you might put a tube into your bender and make a bend here, and then simply move forward and make your bend here. In this case, that will not work. What I have to do is flip the tube around and bend in outwards in both directions, and that's how I can keep my center dimension correct. So you'll see me do that on time lapse, and those are going to be, I don't know what angle those bends are going to be yet. Actually, I'll go and measure that now. So I'm just going to use a very simple protractor to find my approximate angle for this. Obviously, I just place my protractor on a straight angle from here and align with the point, and then point that right to the other end. If I wanted to, I could grab a straight edge to extend that line, but it's pretty close. So I can just visually figure out that that's pretty much it right there, which is about 18 degrees. So I'm going to make my bend probably 15 degrees and then check it. I've got lots of excess on the ends of the tube, so I'll just hold it in front of the bumper and allow the excess to go over the ends, because of course I want the tops of the tubes to be slightly below the tops of the bumper, so I'll want to mock it up in that same orientation. So I'll just hold it again so that the lead and the tail just stick in front of the bumper for the mock-up purposes. So I went for the 15-degree bend, just like I said I would. But I was off on my measurement, because now if I set it down right where it's supposed to go, the bend started at a nice point, and that looks good to me. But I'm already too high on these points, so I bent it too far already. So this piece would be scrap. Only luckily for me, I realized that my original plan of going with a straight tube from this point to this point also won't work, because this part of the bumper protrudes out, or sorry, this part of the grill I should say, and the structure beneath the grill, the grill support, bows out towards the front of the vehicle, and so a straight tube will interfere with it. So I'm going to use this to sit down a little deeper in the back and get beneath this area here. So that's actually going to work out really well for me. So I already have a center point marked. What I'm going to do is just slide this up carefully into place, not touching the vehicle at all. I've got a center line on my winch tray. I'll take you out of the tripod in a minute and show you that. And I line everything up just like so, and now I can mark my points here and here where I want to make my cuts. Of course, they're going to be a little bit too long, but I can bring them each in incrementally, just in little bits, until I get to the point that I'm happy with it. I'd rather do that than make an estimate and be too low on it. So that's the idea. I'll take you out of the tripod and show you these marks so that you know how I've lined everything up. Alright, so of course I had a center line marked on my winch tray, and then also lines through all of my bolt holes, so I was able to use that center line, and then I've lined it up with the line on the rear tube there. So we know that we're dead centered. We've got the same bend pattern that we'll have in the front, so it'll look nice and even, and now I can mark those edges. So here's how, now that I've got all my dimensions figured out and I'm centered and I'm happy with the positioning, here's how I'm going to figure out my cuts. This is 3/8 flat bar, and I figure 3/8 of an inch is going to give me about what I want. So I'm just going to place that against the wing, or vertical support if you prefer to call it that, and make a mark. I'm going to do the same on this side. And then I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Now my reason for that is because when I put this in my saw, the mark is going to be proper on one side, and when I go to turn it the other way, it's going to be on the bottom. I'm not going to be able to see the mark. So it's important to put the marks on both sides, so I'll just find center again, do exactly the same thing, and make these lines. The other thing that's really handy about doing it the way I have is, if this tube was perfectly straight, I could simply take the measurement of this angle here and make that my cut. But because this is on an angle, and so is this, I've got to add them together to figure out that cut. And of course that can be done, and sometimes that's what you have to do. But when you can avoid that by having a physical line to follow, it's so much easier just to place this in the saw, rotate it until the line is perfectly lined up with the saw blade, and away you go. Right? So that's what we're going to do now. I'll just turn it around, make those other marks, and do my cuts. And hopefully that 3/8 will drop it just in there, so the tops of the tubes are just below the top of the bumper. But if I'm wrong about that, of course, I can keep cutting it back. And I don't think I've gone too short already. So let's hope I'm right about that. All right, so we've got the tube in the saw and ready for cutting. Kind of looks like a pair of motorcycle handlebars, actually. But anyway, see all those marks we went over, and there's the cut line, and I simply had to adjust the saw until the cut line lined up with the blade, which turns out to be 37 degrees. Okay, so close but no cigar with those first cuts. You can see I'm just a little too high still, so I'll have to cut a bit more off, but like I said, that's much better than having cut it too short and then you're basically screwed. But still perfectly centered. Everything looks really good. Just got to take a bit more off. And because 3/8 of an inch brought me down as much as it did, I'm going to go for probably just over 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of an inch rather. And that should bring me down pretty much perfectly where I want to be. And there's what 3/16 of an inch cut off either side has done. Just about exactly where I wanted it to wind up. So that's great, and we're still dead center, perfectly flat and level, and it's looking great. I'm very, very happy with that. So I'm just going to put a couple of light tacks on it, and then we'll get the front one done, put a couple of light tacks on that, and then I'll make sure that the winch can still go in and out with relative ease, and we're good to go. Things starting to really come together now. All right, time to do this front tube here, or the fair lead plate tube we could call it. And to help myself out, I've added a piece of angle iron to the front of this and just clamped it in place and centered up and given myself a center line. And I made sure that it was nice and even with the top of the fair lead plate by putting some magnets on there before I clamped it. So we'll just remove these magnets now. The reason that I've added a piece of angle iron here is so that I have a little shelf to place this guy on. When I did the rear tube, I was able to hang it in a position where it sat nice and vertical. It wasn't pitched forward or backwards at all. And then I could mark my lines, and away we went. In this case, I have a little bit of a different scenario, because what happens is, of course, I want this to sit dead level on top of my fairway plate, but I can't do that, of course, because I have legs that are too long on this. So if I was to put it in the position there and then lean these legs forward, I could easily do that and then just go ahead and make my marks, except it would be rotationally incorrect. It'd be sitting with these guys pitched forward, so then when I went to put it in and I rotated it back to the position I wanted it to be in, it wouldn't, the cuts would no longer be in line with these vertical supports. They'd be slightly off. So I've given myself this little shelf. Therefore, I can bring my tube out a little bit, and then I can go in behind and simply mark my lines. Now, before I used a piece of 3/8 flat bar to set my cuts back, but that's because I was sitting my tube like this, and I wanted it to still drop down by, about 1.5 inches. So of course I needed to space those cuts in. In this case, I'm sitting exactly where I want to be, so I can just mark my tube. Turn it around and do exactly the same thing. And that should fit in just about perfect. And there we go. Time to go to the saw again. And there you are. It worked out quite well. It isn't perfect, but it definitely will do. In the end, when I talked about placing that little shelf there so that I could bring my tube forward so I could avoid rotating the tube at all, it might have honestly been better to not do that, because the forward rotation I actually needed a little bit of, was handy in the sense that I needed a tiny bit of rearward rotation. If you see that it's actually leaning just slightly back that way. So had I leaned it forward and made my mark and then turned it around, it probably would have fit just ever so slightly better than it does right now. You can see I've got a bit of a gap and a bit of a gap. But that's only at the fronts. The backs are absolutely tight, so I don't have to worry about heat shrinkage when I weld this up. If there was a gap all the way around, I would not want to weld that in, because it would definitely pull the front of that bumper in a little bit. But because there's good solid mating surfaces all the way around, except those gaps that I showed you on the front there, it'll be just fine, and that is definitely not too much to fill with some weld beads. So I'm happy with that. That should work just fine. I'll tack both these tubes in place after lunch, and then we'll drop the winch back in. Hopefully it fits well, and we'll move on from there. But so far, I'm really happy with the progress. It's starting to look really cool, I think. Hooray! The winch still fits. It's a tight squeeze, but it fits very nicely. Everything's in place, and the bumper is almost finished in terms of its design. I may still put some tubing underneath these outside wings to support them a little bit and to kind of look cool. The little piece you can see in there right now is just a temporary brace. I can actually remove that at this point, and the other side has the same thing, of course. So I may replace those with something more permanent that kind of looks cool, or I may not. I'm going to play with that idea. And then the customer still wanted that addition to the bull bar, a second bar, which basically comes from this point, comes forward, goes over, and goes back to that point. And the idea being he'd mount his high lift up here and then his lights out in front of that. But I am not sure that the radius I have to deal with on my dies will look good with that, so I'm going to approach that shortly as well. And that's a wrap for part 2 of this series. Please do come back for part 3, and of course check out all my other videos, including those on screen. Like I mentioned earlier, you get some good tube bending tips from them. And thanks so much for joining me here at Balmer's Workshop. Your views are very much appreciated. If you do find yourself coming back and getting good content here, then please consider subscribing. It would help me out massively. Thanks again so much. Come back any old time, and I'll get another video out to you as soon as I can.